to Sherman's March to the Sea. Now, the question is, where does this come in naval history, and why am I doing this on Naval History Channel? Well, it's one of those things. The American Civil War was very, very much a literal war, in that amphibious warfare, whether it was riverine or actual full-on amphibious operations, whether they were administrative landings or full-on assaults, were a big part of the American Civil War. And they had to be, because there are limited options available to you for how to move around. There are limited options available to you for where to go and for what to get there with. There aren't really that many roads. There aren't that you want to take an entire army down. There's a reason why in this March to the Sea, Sherman marches with his formation split up across 4 roads, sometimes as many as 6 roads, marching in parallel, but the corps are each making their own way. So he's got 2... Thank you. He's got 2 armies, and each is divided into 2 corps, and one of those corps actually has 4 divisions, but the rest usually have 3. And most divisions have, well, 3 brigades. Some seem to have slightly more. And he's moving a large force. Now, this is something which becomes quite common in the American Civil War, in that the army sizes grow dramatically. And they're always going to. Because the easiest way to get an advantage over your opponent is to have a bigger army. And when you're fighting a land war, especially a maneuver war, you always need more troops. You don't not only need more troops at the battle, but you need more troops to get to the battle in the first place, because you need more of a logistics trade. You need more organization. You need more protection on your route. As you can see, there is someone who very much wants to be part of this. He always wants to be part of it. And Sherman's March to the Sea is a good example of this. And it's also a good example of amphibious warfare, because despite it being about a march to the sea, the reason he's marching to the sea, and the important thing that happens when he reaches the sea, is he meets up with an Admiral Dahlin, who gives him, hello, here are your siege guns. Your big, massive guns you couldn't bring with you, because they would have slowed you down and been impossible to move. So you could have never done the high-sea maneuver. Oh, good. Now I have my large army in the right place, and I have the large sea weapons in the right place, and I can take the point of area, the city, which I want from the Confederacy. It's also a point at which you have to admit one fallacy of history that is often repeated when we talk about the American Civil War. And that is this: that as long as the army stood, the Confederacy would still stand. That as long as the armies existed, the Confederacy still existed. Because that's false. And you know why that's false? It's a lovely myth. It's a spiritual myth. You know, we still have an army. We still stand. We are great. That's fine. And they often quote things like Prussia and the Napoleonic Wars, etc. But that leaves off the fact that the reason why Prussia could often survive in the Napoleonic Wars, even if it did lose everything but its army, was the fact that they were living off the British government's checkbook. There was no one writing such checks for the Confederacy. There was no one supporting the Confederacy outside. No one outside, well, there might have been powers outside who wished to support the Confederacy, but they couldn't, because the only power which could have broken the American blockade wasn't inclined to break the Union blockade. And that, of course, is Britain. They didn't want to. They felt it wasn't in their interests, and also they really didn't like slavery. So they didn't. So no one else could. So that meant the Confederacy was on its own. It had no external support. And without external support, that means it's dependent upon internal support for shoes, for belts, for trousers, for coats, for muskets, for rifles, for munitions, for food, for everything. And I know that was probably annoying, but the point is, if you cannot supply these things, you don't have an army in the field. And very quickly, starving troops tend to stop supporting you. They tend to go home. And the ones you're left with are no doubt a committed warrior band, but they're increasingly the ones who either don't have any place to go because no one wants them at home, which might not be the best for you to organize and might not be the most reliable troops you ever have, or the ones who are so overtly passionate and committed to your cause they would never go home anyway, but they're also probably the ones who are going to spend half their time critiquing you if you try and behave in a military fashion. And when we consider this, one of the whole battle issues you have here is that the Sherman's March to the Sea, the reason it's successful as it is because Johnston has been replaced with Hood, who is... I don't know where he gets his military intelligence from, but it's nowhere near a military. That is one of the interesting things about the American Civil War. It is one of those beautiful things for command structures and command styles, because you can look at all these officers and some of them come out of nowhere apparently and are really, really good. And then when you bury back, you find out why they have their experience. Grant, very, very good at organizing his troops for a long time. Why? Because he spent quite a while as a quartermaster. And of course, he has a reputation as a drunk. But mostly he seems to have got that reputation because he was separated from his wife for so long and his family for so long and seems to quite like his family, unlike quite a lot of officers at this time. And basically he responded by drinking to give himself a reason to get out the army because he wanted to go back home. And then we have all sorts of things. Sherman, Thomas. Thomas is always considered slow, methodical, viable. He's actually quite critical into the March to the Sea and never takes part in it because he's on a completely different campaign, which is not on the end. Anyway, so this is the US Civil War in three rather interesting maps. Please note, these are all the areas, at the bottom are the areas claimed by the Confederacy. Some of them, not so much Confederacy. Some of them, theoretically Confederacy, but very quickly Union. Some of them are supposedly active Confederacy, but you very quickly find that states' rights is a lovely motto, but not a great motto for fighting a war. Because, if you're doing this by states' rights rules, you end up face to face with a situation that is very simple. Who's in charge? So let's standardize logistics, because for logistics to work, everyone has to have the same gun, or at least similar, same to similar ammunition, so they can all use it, and preferably follow the same orders and have the same command structure, so you know who's in charge of what. States' rights where everyone has their own almost militia / National Guard, but not as the modern American National Guard is, which basically it's the Army Reserve, but a National Guard that really is a National Guard, can cause issues. There's also one of those interesting things that one of the debates pre-US Civil War, or sometimes it comes into history, is the amount of arms being sold from federal armories to southern states. You know, they have all sorts of things being sold by pro-southern Democrat politicians from the federal, federal politicians. That actually is more of a problem than an advantage. And The reason it's a problem is because it gives you a lot of equipment which is not very good. One of the advantages for the Union is that because of this stuff being sold off and because they have quite a large industry and because they are actually able to import from outside, means they rebuild. And, well, in modern cases, they buy newer, better stuff. And they can support newer, better stuff, which gives them an advantage in battles. Because one of the long-term lessons of the US Civil War, and frankly, this is also a long-term lesson for the Royal Navy from Napoleonic Wars, and many other wars have shown this. If you go back to them, you can go back to the battles of Agincourt and Crécy, and they have the same example. It's better to expend things than people. I.e., it's better to fire things at your enemy at range in vast quantity, some might damage, some might not, than it is to have to engage in close combat and expend people, unless you have to. Longbows, arrows, an extreme example of that, but again, the broadside firing and the rate of fire of Royal Navy warships versus the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar, and again throughout the US Civil War. The side which could fire the most quickly, tends to win the battle. And again, numbers help with this. You have Scott's plan, the Great Snake. Basically, go down using rivers on one side and the sea on the other side and their own territorial borders to basically cocoon the Confederacy, wrap it up, and starve it. Because Scott has noticed something which many others should have noticed. That when it comes to industry, the South is short. When it comes to many of the layers of logistics and infrastructure and supply lines, the South is missing key components. The top is the reality. The top map illustrates counties in the United States where battles took place. And it really does become interesting when you look at where battles are taking place and where they are in consecutive years. You can see that this fight is very much a Washington-Richmond fight. Again, Confederacy has to put their capital in Richmond, Virginia, because that's the center of their infrastructure, the center of industry, the only place they actually have their things. But it's also the most stupid place to put it, because you're putting your capital on the front line, right in, right to one side. What you should have done is put it in the center, down south somewhere. Especially if you'd had infrastructure to do it. Had some railway lines built prior to the war. There are all sorts of things which need to be done in preparation for the Civil War, for the Confederacy to have had any chance of success. They didn't do any of them. So the course of the US Civil War was decided a decade or so before it happened, when the North starts getting infrastructure like railways, which go across it and interlink it at various levels, and the South doesn't. I do declare that they needed some more infrastructure. But there again, if you rely on slave labor, which is terrible for the slaves, but is also corrupting for those who rely on it, you don't tend to think about things like infrastructure, because doing these things is someone else's job who you don't care about. And that's the thing. Slavery is a terrible thing in every single level. But it not only saps the moral, I think it saps the strategic thinking of the class, of the aristocracy, of the people who are in charge of it. Because if you don't care about the person who's doing the work, you're not going to care about how difficult it is. And if you don't care about how difficult it is, you're not going to think about how difficult it is. So you're never going to think, hang on, this could be done a better, easier way. And you're the ones with the money, usually, because you're in charge. And that's usually the people who have the money. Anyway, so, first of all, we have the Vicksburg campaign. And the Vicksburg campaign is interesting because, in many ways, it is a forerunner, along with the Meridian campaign, of the March to the Sea. It's about maneuver. It's about, in many ways, forcing the Confederacy to abandon very strong positions by going round them. It's forcing them to come out and fight. The whole campaign would result in nearly 40,000 losses total, including those surrendering, for the Confederacy, versus 10,000 for the Union. And the Union, it can be argued, started out with a little over 73,000 to the possibly as low as 43,000 Confederacy. They could have been. There are arguments they were about 66,000, and you can argue that. And there are people who make the case that the Union were about 28,000. But yeah, that's a rather big run. And basically, the purpose of the Vicksburg campaign is the river. It's the Mississippi River. And it's to get access to the Louisiana and the lower portion of the Mississippi River. It's to move your forces forward, because you need fleets like Porter's fleet, illustrated here, to move your logistics and move your supplies. So this is actually a campaign which is a campaign of maneuver fought to provide logistical supply. Because if you can break the Confederate hold of Vicksburg, which is a very critical defensive position, you can achieve a tremendous amount of maneuver. And it doesn't matter if they have an army in the field or not. You now control all the area around them, and you can use the Mississippi to get your supplies up and down it. It's an operation which starts off badly, and you have to say it does start off badly. There are several issues in the bayou, etc., where things do not go to plan, and works out. And it's a risky operation. And this is the point. The Western theater of the American Civil War is the one area of maneuver. You can almost write off every other theater, the main theater. The main theater is a slogging match. The main theater is, yes, we will try maneuvers, but ultimately it's to Washington, to Richmond, to Washington, to Richmond. Why do we keep fighting in Bull Run? It's one of the worst terrains in the world to have a battle in. It is. And I know I haven't visited personally, but I've read so many books and I've studied it so many times on maps. Every time I look at it, I just think, why? Maybe if I'm lucky enough to visit there and actually walk around the site, I will get a different impression of the Bull Run, and I will see, yeah, I can see why they picked this spot to have so many battles. But honestly, I'm doubting it. It's kind of like a few of the battles in the English Civil War, or the War of the Four Kingdoms. Because when you wander round it, and you sit there and look at them and go, yeah. You literally had this fight here because this is where the two armies both washed up, isn't it? Not because anyone sensible would actually like to fight a fight here. It's just not a good position to be in. But in contrast, the war in the West has these maneuvers, has these campaigns going on. It has logistics that is more complicated than just, we'll have a big depot here because we're never going to be that far away from it. And it's also where, in many ways, the Confederacy is at its weakest. Because again, their strongest army is deployed to Virginia because they have to defend their critical infrastructure in Richmond and in Virginia, which has most of their industrial base, and it's also their capital. Again, no long-term thinking about this. You can tell the Confederacy is one of those things which happens more because nobody sits there and goes, "Are you sure we aren't all being insane?" It's groupthink. It's basically the things aren't going our way. We don't want things to change. Therefore, and you sit there and go, did any of you really think this one through? Any of you? Wait a couple of years, build some industry, invest, then do it. You might stand a chance. No, okay. We can be thankful for that, but it kind of makes the horrendous loss of life on both sides even worse when you realize that the side which kicked it all off, and I know there's a debate on some people try and debate that one, but let's be honest, seceding and all the other things kind of they can claim they were pushed into it, but they actually were the ones who did it. It's kind of like if you punch someone first in a fight. You can claim they were being rude and nasty to you, but it's not self-defense if you actually punched them first. As provocative as they are being, it's the old sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt thing. Doesn't matter how many times you're getting provoked, if you respond with violence, you're the one who's kicked it off. But one of the interesting things, though, about the war in the West is the paucity of the Union cavalry for this whole thing. I mean, seriously. Let's ignore the personalities and ignore the other issues with them. For some reason, the Union gets the better generals from a logistics perspective. They get people who actually tend to work together slightly better. They have their own internecine fights, they do. But they actually work together, broadly speaking. But the South gets the better cavalry commanders. Now, this perhaps shows how cavalry becomes less important in a maneuver war. Because when you're dealing with the Western theater, the Confederacy has the better cavalry, but at no point as the war goes on does that start to decisively wear down the Union. The Union has I would argue in the West, the more mobile, more mobility-centric forces. Yes, they're infantry, but they are more mobile. And they're moving. So what matters is the speed and mobility of your army as a whole to winning the war. The cavalry will grant you some spectacular victories, especially in the rear of enemy operations. They will get through, they will wear down the enemy, and they will force them to have to garrison areas. But that only really works if you're dealing with an enemy who's of similar military strength in terms of numbers as you are. If you're dealing with an enemy who is outnumbering you 3 or 4 to 1, then they can afford to garrison 50% of their forces around places to protect from cavalry attack, and still have 2 to 1 advantages in the battlefields. In which case, you've just expended a load of resources to tie up their troops, but also you've just spent a load of resources which actually benefit them in a way, because otherwise they'd have to use all those troops, and let's be honest, not all of them are the best quality on that you want moving around with a mobile army. And if you had them all available to move, then you'd want to move them all, in which case that would slow down their movement of their armies somewhat dramatically. So, in a funny way, your cavalry operations, which are daring and wonderful, kind of help your enemy out. But they're daring and wonderful. Plus, they kind of allow the disposal of generals who are being annoying or a bit slow or just aren't delivering the level of results you want. You can give them something which is technically a promotion. You have Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, of course, one of the more famous of the officers, but also you have Holneck, who at one point was in charge of Grant, but really didn't do that well in charge of Grant. You have Sherman, you have Thomas, you have Don Carlos Buell, who was frankly one of the most aristocratic officers you ever had running an American formation in the Civil War. In terms of how he acted, it's very much like a European staff. Anyway, you have the wonderful William Rosecrans, who's probably one of the better officers, but he doesn't get as much attention as he deserves. And you have McPherson, who is, well, possesses a very fine beard. You have, on the Confederate side, you have Johnston. In fact, you have two Johnstons, both of whom are probably some of the better officers involved. You have Beauregard, who thinks he's one of the better officers involved. You have Bragg, who tries his best, certainly. You have Hood, who I'm probably going to be quite rude at by the end of this. You have Smith, who doesn't really get any attention and probably likes it that way. And you have Forrest, who is, what can I say, an interesting officer. You also have the fact that if you look down the list, the Union troops commanders are often commanding far larger forces in the field, actually, than the Confederates do, because the Confederates often have quite significant forces on paper, but whereas the Union has trouble with people getting given furloughs and sent home and all sorts of benefits provided, the Confederacy has trouble with people just disappearing and bad accountancy and bad admin and sending people to the wrong place and people just not being able to turn up where they're supposed to because they can't actually physically get there because of infrastructure. But you will notice that General, Lieutenant General, Major General, and then this one. It's the revolt of the Major Generals with a Lieutenant General on top. There is a reason for this. The United States are Congress is very loath to give out any promotions. The ranks of the army are very, very limited, and they have a sort of abhorrent approach to it. And that when you're looking at the forces involved in the actual march to the sea, you'll notice something kind of interesting. You start to realize that not all major generals or generals are equal, because some are a major general to volunteers, but not a major general in the army. Cute. And they can have a substantive rank, which is actually very, very different to what their real rank is. And do you know what's even more fun? Is the fact that the US still has this same policy in World War I. When you're looking at some of the officers involved in World War I, there is their substantive rank and there is their rank they're acting in. And you're going, okay. Finally, they get this sorted by about World War II, when the US admits that maybe having a well-structured career progression and senior officer ranks might help. And it won't necessarily create an aristocracy or anything like that, which we've been trying to avoid. And all great things. Of course, then they create MacArthur as a 5-star general, and that kind of turns all that on the head. But they were trying, okay? They were trying. So, my favorite of all the US officers. Love him or loathe him, Grant is a character. And the reason I've got Grant here is because of his Vicksburg campaign. That's where Sherman starts to think about this. And then he does the Meridian campaign, which is less successful than it wants to be. There's always a debate about what the actual plan for the Meridian campaign was. And Sherman always claims that his plan, the plan he actually had, was successful. But everyone's fairly certain that whatever he's protesting on paper, he actually wanted to do more than he accomplished. But Grant has fought a maneuver war primarily by trying to be strong where the Confederates are weak and trying to win battles without fighting in many ways. He likes to deal with all the things off the stage, so he sets the battle, and by the time you get to the battle, he's decided as much of it as possible. The one problem this can happen, and this does happen to him when he's back in Virginia and on that favorite run, is that if he's made up his mind and he's got all the information before battle, if he doesn't get really accurate intelligence that when he's launching a battle and he's been delayed, he can still follow through on a plan and suddenly find that actually Lee has managed to dig himself in a position that he thought was weak. So, but there again, to be fair to Grant at that point, he had got very used to the Army of the West's approach to things, and I think the Army of the Potomac and that sort of area is, I think they have good generals in charge, but I think they're used to a certain style of war by that point, and Grant takes a while to adjust them, A, to his style of fighting, and B, to adjust his style of fighting to the situations of Virginia and the battles that are going on there. Dahlgren, he's an important officer for this. That's him standing next to one of the guns he helps design and develop. The father of American naval ordnance. I'm never quite sure what he would say, but one of the interesting questions I was once asked by Sherman was, what would he have thought of the Iowa-class battleships? My honest opinion is that if he'd been alive for another 130 years and seen the Iowa-class battleships, A, he'd have been sitting there going, I'm older than Methuselah. B, he'd have probably been asking for a double shot or something. I guess at that age you might as well. And C, he'd have probably gone, your guns have only got that big. I can imagine him wanting bigger guns. And he is critical because there is no point Sherman doing any of the risk he does, any of the things he does, if he isn't going to reach Dahlgren. And if we go back to the Vicksburg campaign, there was no point in any of the land maneuvers, any of the operations Grant could do, unless Porter got his fleet to him. Because that fleet's the heavy weapons. That's the heavy weapons moving to support you. That's the logistics train. And it's the same with the march to the sea. It's not just marching to sea as a sort of shavash. We're not just going to destroy everything on the way. That is partially what they're doing, and destroying the infrastructure, destroying the food supplies, destroying all the things which are supporting the Confederate army in the field and forcing them to concentrate on other things. But if you march to the sea and your objective, and you have to remember, the big objective of the march to the sea is Savannah. It is this big major city. To get from Atlanta to Savannah, and it's always amazed me that Atlanta is not actually on the Atlantic coast. It just seems to me that Atlanta should be on the Atlantic, but I'll get that out of my head for a second and mention that so it's now over. But they're marching from Atlanta to Savannah. If you get to Savannah and you don't have any heavy weapons, you're in trouble. You need those heavy weapons to have any chance of taking Savannah in time for your own supplies and your own logistics not to run out, because you're deep in enemy territory. But conversely, if you take Savannah and you manage to do that, then thanks to the railways and the other lines, you have now not only, if we go back to this lovely drawing here, back here, you have not only encircled the Confederacy, but you've cut it up into segments. You've made it unable to support other parts. And this is the point. And you look, you can see this is Sherman's march is on this map. Atlanta to Savannah. And then he goes up. So he bisects Georgia. He cuts the Confederacy in half at this point. And now he can march up, and he's got a secure base to come from to march up and attack the back of Virginia. Which is, again, part of Grant's overall strategy. Because Scott's plan would win, and Grant knows this, but it won't win fast enough for the politicians. And who does he trust to do all this? He trusts Sherman. And there's a reason I've given Sherman his battle list here, because, well, it's nice to be polite to him, but also he's the actual commander in the field. And I could have put Grants and Dahlgrens in, but... So, he's born February 8th, 1820, in Lancaster, Ohio, United States. He dies in the February the 14th, 1891, age 71, literally just 6 days past his birthday, in New York City. He's buried in Cavalry Cemetery Street, Cavalry Cemetery, St. Louis, Missouri. And he's technically, we're going to go for Republican, but it's kind of like Grant's a Republican, in that Grant becomes a Republican during the war. Prior to that, he's probably best described as a Northern Democrat, in that his wife has very strong Democratic Democratic sympathies, and he is agnostic, so he's not going to really differ on that much. But he is anti-slavery, despite having several at some points worked with slaves. He gets basically any slave he owns. He even when it makes him poorer, he frees them. And it's the same with Sherman. He's a Republican by this point. Nicknames: Campanile and Uncle Billy. Years of service: 1840 to 1853. So he'd served 13 years in the U.S. Army. And then, again, like many other officers, they didn't have any use for them. They let them go. They had a very small army. They liked it a very small army because they were worried about the army being used to oppress anyone, and they also didn't want to pay the bill. We often think about the U.S. Navy having trouble with Congress. The U.S. Army has even more trouble, because at least the U.S. Navy gets to sail away from them occasionally. I'm often wondering if the reason the U.S. Army has quite such a big presence in Germany and other countries around the world is to buy them some peace, but leave it to one side. He was Major General in the Army by the time of the end of the war, and he then became General of the Army, postbellum. Very few officers got to be made to Lieutenant General. In fact, for Grant to get his promotion to Lieutenant General, there had to be an act of Congress. His commands included 15 Corps in 1863, the Army of Tennessee, 63 to 64, the Military Division of Mississippi, 64 to 65, Department of Missouri, 66 to 69, and Commanding General of the U.S. Army, 1869 to 1883. And we can all sit there and go, well, Doesn't that mean he was 63 when he retired? Yes. Yes, it does. Would any of you people, would anyone like to tell this gentleman that he needs to retire? If you wouldn't, then don't worry, you're in the same camp as me. I have a feeling if he was looking at that and going, retire? I'd probably go, yes, would you like to go, would you like to go for the evening, go have some food, or maybe go to bed? You've had a long day. You were talking about this in the morning. It's been a long day. It's already 8 a.m. I'm going to now quickly vacate the room. So, why haven't I discussed these two officers that much? Well, because, honestly, if I'm talking about Grant and Sherman, the best way to talk about them is in their own words. This is Grant to Sherman. Dear Sherman, the bill reviving the grade of Lieutenant General in the Army has become law, and my name has been sent to the Senate for the place. I now receive orders to report at Washington immediately. In person, which indicates either a confirmation or a likelihood of confirmation. I start in the morning to comply with the order, but I shall say very distinctly on my arrival there that I shall accept no appointment which will require me to make that city my headquarters. This, however, is not what I started out to write about. While I have been eminently successful in this war, in at least gaining the confidence of the public, no one feels more than I how much of this success is due to the energy, skill, and harmonious putting forth of that energy and skill of those whom it has been my good fortune to have occupying subordinate positions under me. There are many officers to whom these remarks are applicable, to a greater or lesser degree, proportionate to their ability as soldiers, but what I want is to express my thanks to you and Macpherson, as the men to whom, above all others, I feel indebted for whatever I have had of success. How far your advance and suggestions have been of assistance, you know. How far your execution of whatever has been given to you to do entitles you to the reward I am receiving, you cannot know as well as I do. I feel all the gratitude this letter would express, giving it the most flattering construction. The word you I use in plural, intending it for Macpherson also. I should write to him, and will some day, but starting in the morning, I do not know that I will find time just now. Your friend, U.S. Grant, Major General. The response, written 6 days later. Dear General, I have your more than kind and characteristic letter of the 4th, and will send a copy of it to General Macpherson at once. You do yourself injustice and us too much honour in assigning us so large a share of the merits which have led to your high advancement. I know you approve the friendship I have ever professed to you, and will permit me to continue as heretofore to manifest it on all proper occasions. You are now Washington's legitimate successor, and occupy a position of almost dangerous elevation. But if you can continue as heretofore to be yourself, simple, honest, and unpretending, you will enjoy through life the respect and love of friends, and the homage of millions of human beings, who will award to you a large share of securing to them and their descendants government of law and stability. I repeat, you do General Macpherson and myself too much honour. At Belmont, you manifested your traits, neither of us being near. At Donelson, also, you illustrated your whole character. I was not near, and General Macpherson in too subordinate a capacity to influence you. Until you had won Donelson, I confess I was almost cowed by the terrible array of anarchical elements that presented themselves at every point. But that victory emitted the ray of light which I have followed ever since. I believe you are as brave, patriotic, and just as the great prototype Washington, as unselfish, kind-hearted, and honest as a man should be. But the chief characteristic in your nation is the simple faith in success you have always manifested, which I can liken to nothing else than the faith a Christian has in his Saviour. This faith gave you victory at Shiloh and Vicksburg. Also, when you've completed your best preparations, you go into battle without hesitation, as at Chattanooga. No doubts, no reserve, and I tell you that it was this that made us act with confidence. I knew wherever I was that you thought of me, and if I got in a tight place, you would come, if alive. My only points of doubts were as to your knowledge of grand strategy and of books of science and history, but I confess your common sense seems to have supplied all this. Now, as to the future, do not stay in Washington. Halleck is better qualified than you are to stand the buffets of intrigue and policy. Come out west, take to yourself the whole Mississippi Valley. Let us make it dead sure. And I tell you, the Atlantic slope and Pacific shores will follow its destiny as sure as the limbs of a tree live or die with the main trunk. We have done much, still much remains to be done. Time and time's influence are all with us. We could almost afford to sit still and let these influences work. Even in the seceded states, your word now would go further than the president's proclamation or an act of Congress. For God's sake and for your country's sake, come out of Washington. I foretold to General Halleck before he left Corinth the inevitable result to him, and I now exhort you to come out of West. Here lies the seat of the coming empire, and from the west, when our task is done, we'll make short work of Charleston and Richmond and the impoverished coast of the Atlantic. Your sincere friend, W.T. Sherman. There are some times in history when you have to follow a point by analyzing it. There are some points in history where you have to absolutely state clearly and absolutely so it can the point can be discerned what you're making. But there are some times in history it is better to just leave the evidence and move on, because it speaks for itself. So let's consider the Army of Tennessee, commanded by Major General Howard. It's an interesting gent. And it's one of the core forces. It will take the right flank or the southern side of the attack on the march from Atlanta to Savannah. It consisted of 2 corps, 15 corps, commanded by Major General Peter J. Osterhaus, with the divisions of commanded by Brigadier General Charles R. Woods, Brigadier General William B. Hazen, Johnny Smith, and John M. Corse. Interestingly enough, this 4-brigadier set of 4 divisions of 15 corps were consistently to the south, and consistently the division holding the south. At some points, it actually divides in 2 and is going down 2 roads. One for the Ogeechee River, and one sort of more the Statsboro River, etc. That sort of the Kenosha River, or one of its tributaries. But this is the unit which is holding, you could say, the more at risk side, because no one expects the Northern Army to come south, because they're going to have Grant. Now, Howard, he lost his right arm. He had, in the Battle of Fair Oaks or Seven Pines in June 1882, an action which would earn him a Medal of Honor. So they're fairly aggressive, fairly capable officer. He is known as a Christian general because, well, he did try and bring evangelical piety to his role as a general, but never let that get in the way of actually doing some really quite nasty things if they were necessary to win. He ran the Freedmen's Bureau at one point during the Reconstruction era, and he is very much a campaigner for the northern side. In contrast, facing them. Yes, you might have Meade. Yes, this, Pontomac and all those things. But there is a large army up there. And the army of North Virginia can not withdraw. So the Confederates from the north aren't probably going to be interfering in this. But the ones from the south might. The rest of the ones might come along. There is theoretically Hood around. Now, Hood is being taken care of by Thomas, but that's a whole different thing. And you have Major General Frank Blair, who's commanding 17 Corps. And again, if you look at this, you're sort of going, well, hang on. If you expected any division to have, any corps to have a second major general in it, it would probably be the one which has 4 brigades, right? But no. The 17 Corps has another major general in it, Joseph A. Moore, who's in charge of that division. And the 2 other divisions are commanded by brigadier generals. So the more complicated operation is being done, and the more arguably more important, by Osterhaus with his 4 brigadiers. So these are the 2 officers you're talking about, Osterhaus and Blair. Again, smart, respectable, capable officers. Osterhaus is probably the harder driver of the 2, and again, it's pretty important. As you can see, as it's set up, there are 2 army commanders. They're both under the command of Sherman, of course, and there are 4 corps commanders, and there's also a sort of independent cavalry division, which we're talking about its commander of, but I do love Sherman's phrase when he talks about him. Oh. No less good are his corps commanders. You have Osterhaus, who, has division commanders, who, as I mentioned, was again another aggressive officer. He commanded the division during the Vicksburg campaign, fighting in the Battle of Champion Hill and the Battle of the Big Black River Bridge. Love seeing these names. His division was part of the force which stopped the intervention of Joseph Johnson, and he took part in Sherman's advance to the Mississippi, which had protected the Army of Tennessee during its siege operations. He's a critical officer. Blair. Well, let's see. Francis Preston Blair. He's theoretically a Democrat before 1848 and from 1866 to 75. But he becomes a Free Soil member, 1848 to 1854, and joins the Republican Party, 1854 to 66. This guy is a politician, and he likes to have photos of him with his staff, which, again, all have this dashing look of young, connected officers. Oh, hey-ho. Also, he very much believes that this side is his more photogenic side, because in almost every photo he seems to be pictured doing this, staring off in the distance. And I understand it's used to project regal confidence and power, but to me it looks a bit weird if you do it in every single photo. It's like you're staging. No one photograph. I will look this way. And I will have my hat on my leg. Sorry, I shouldn't be cruel. But what's also interesting about this army was that it was originally Grant's army. The army in Tennessee had originally been Grant's army from 1862. They fought at the Battle of Shiloh. They're a very experienced force overall. So, yes, you might have questions about some of the choice of leadership and who's in charge and why they're in charge, but they've all had to prove themselves pretty proficient to run this group. Then we have the left wing, on the Army of Georgia under Slocum. Now, Slocum is one of those generals who doesn't get really enough attention in any way, shape, or form. And he should do. He's one of the youngest major generals in the US Army. He'd fought throughout the Eastern Theater in Georgia and Carolinas. He commanded regiments, brigade, division, and a corps in the Army of the Potomac. He saw action First Bull Run. He Peninsula Campaign, Harper's Ferry, Surf Mountain, Antietam, and Chancellorsville. He is a very senior, very successful officer. And he's given command of a force which is sort of amalgamation force, because the Army of the Cumberland, which had been originally Admiral Anderson's Army of the Ohio, but became Cumberland under Rosecrans, has two corps taken out of it. And they are created into the Army of Georgia. So this is almost a new unit. And he's given those some pretty good officers to make this sort of force of. He's got Jefferson C. Davis, who gets a lot of, stuff for actually having the same name, a lot of flack, let's say, for having the same name as the President of the Confederacy, but who was also known for having killed a superior officer in 1862. And basically ended up killing General William Bull Nelson in Louisville in September 1862. Basically, he's led off because of a shortage of senior officers and experienced officers. And it was considered that the two had bad blood at that point. And one of the coolest names, and again, these are corps being commanded by brigadiers. So we can sit there and go, hang on, there's one major general here. All these ones are brigadiers. If we go back to this one, there are three major generals, including one in charge of one of the divisions. And these corps. Now there's a single major general, and he's got a bevy of brigadiers. Scratch unit, anyone? But they're all fairly good officers. They're looking at them going, maybe we'll promote you, maybe we won't. We'll see how you do in this campaign. Alphonse S. Williams is, how do I put this? Possibly one of the older officers involved in this fight, because this is 1864, and he was born in 1810, so he's 54 years old, and he looks it. In comparison, Davis, born in 28, so 18 years younger than him. And yet he's possibly also one of the most aggressive. He was involved in the Civil War from the outbreak. He was involved in training the First Army of Volunteers in his state. He's promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers in 1861. He was a brigade commander in Major General Nathaniel Banks' division of the Army of Pontomac from 1861 to 1862. He assumed divisional command in the 5th Corps of the Army of Pontomac in 1862. Division is then transferred to the Department of Shenandoah. And basically he is sent with Banks to fight Major General Thomas, basically Stonewall Jackson, in the Shenandoah Valley. They are outmaneuvered. More Banks is outmaneuvered than Williams. Williams actually does quite well with his unit. His unit is where it needs to be when it needs to be, as instructed by Banks, and he's trying to push further. He's then transferred to the Army of Virginia under Pope, and he basically carries on getting promoted. But the trouble is, he's a very good divisional commander, but no one's really gives him the opportunity to promote him. And he actually assumes temporary command of a corps after, I think it's after Sharpsburg. But he doesn't get to keep it. The war goes on, and eventually he is sent down to Sherman and to the Army of Georgia, where he comes alive. He has finally he's got a corps commander who recognizes his energy. Well, he is a corps commander, but he's got he has an army commander who recognizes his energy, and he has all the way up here, he has a senior officer who recognizes energy and prepares to use him. And again, he gets used. If you watch the sort of the map, what's 20 Corps doing? 20 Corps are the central run direct to Savannah. So 15 Corps are protecting the southern flank. 14th Corps, under Brigadier General Davis here, are the northern flank. Basically, Jefferson Davis is facing Jefferson Davis. And 20 Corps, their job is to run as fast and as hard as they can for Savannah. And what's interesting is actually at certain points, 14 Corps and 20 Corps actually swap over. Because at one point, 20 Corps is the external corps until they get to Milledgeville. And then from that point onwards, 20 Corps is the inner corps and they are heading towards Savannah. Whereas Blair never swaps over with 15th Corps. The cavalry division is under a gentleman called Brigadier General Kilpatrick, who is an example of the paucity of general officers the Union had for cavalry. Here is how valuable the cavalry is for Sherman, in his opinion. He has a cavalry corps. He has several divisions of it. He leaves them all with Thomas and takes only one division with him. And this is what he says of the commander. I know that Kilpatrick is a hell of a damn fool, but I want just that sort of man to command my cavalry on this expedition. Suggests that cavalry is the expendable force here. Although they do have some interesting cavalry units. They have the 1st Alabama Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Spencer, who actually, in many ways, Sherman seems to use more as his cavalry consultant than he uses Kilpatrick. In fact, he seems to listen more to Spencer when it comes to cavalry than pretty much anyone else on this campaign. And that might well be sensible, because they are designated as Sherman's escort campaign, and they're the 1st Alabama Cavalry Regiment. They are a regiment recruited from Southern Unionists that served in the Union Army during the American Civil War. They are the only predominantly white Union regiment from Alabama. In fact, it's believed that of the 2,678 white Alabamans who enlisted in the Union Army, 2,066 served with the 1st Alabama Cavalry, which is amazing, but also suggests they had a high loss rate. It's recruited from Huntsville, Alabama, and Memphis, Tennessee, in October 1862, after federal troops had taken the area, and it does well. When it's mustered out of service at Huntsville, Alabama, on October 20th, 1865, there are only 397 men present. Out of the 2,000 men who'd served in the unit during the course of the war, 345 were killed in action, died in prison of disease or other non-battle causes. 88 were captured, 279 deserted, and There is no separate account or accurate account of the number of wounded, because they seem to have tended to their own healthcare whenever they needed to. So, field orders. What's Sherman telling everyone to do? Headquarters, Military Division, Mississippi. In the field from Kingston, Georgia, November 9th, 1864. For the purpose of military operations, this army is divided into two wings. These, the right wing, Major General O.O. Howard, commanding, comprised of the 15th and 17th Corps. The left wing, Major General H.W. Slocum, commanding, composed of the 14th and 20th Corps. The habitual order of march will be, whenever practicable, by 4 roads as nearly parallel as possible, and converging at points hereafter to be indicated in orders. The cavalry, Brigadier General Kirkpatrick commanding, will receive special orders from the Commander-in-Chief. There'll be no general train of supplies, but each corps will have its ammunition train and provision train distributed habitually as follows. Behind each regiment should follow 1 wagon and 1 ambulance. Behind each brigade should follow a due proportion of ammunition, wagons, provisions, wagons, and ambulances. In case of danger, each corps commander should change his order of march by having his advance and rear brigades unencumbered by wheels. The separate columns will start habitually at 7 a.m. and make about 15 miles per day, unless otherwise fixed in orders. The army will forage liberally on the country during the march. To this end, each brigade commander will organize a good and sufficient foraging party under command of 1 or more discreet officers, who will gather near the routes traveled corn or forage of any kind, meat of any kind, vegetables, cornmeal, or whatever is needed by the command, aiming at all times to keep in the wagons at least 10 days' provisions for the command and 3 days' forage. Soldiers must not enter the dwellings of the inhabitants or commit any trespass, but during a halt or a camp, they may be permitted to gather turnips, potatoes, and other vegetables, and to drive in stock to their camp. Regular foraging parties must be instructed the gathering of provisions and forage at any distance from the road travelled. To Army Corps commanders alone is entrusted the power to destroy mills, houses, cotton gins, and for them, this general principle is laid down. In districts and neighborhoods where the army is unmolested, no destruction of such property should be permitted. But should guerrillas or bushwhackers molest our march, or should the inhabitants burn bridges, obstruct roads, or otherwise manifest local hostility, then army commanders should order and enforce devastation more or less relentless according to the measure of such hostility. As for horses, mules, wagons, and belongings of the inhabitants, the cavalry and artillery may appropriate freely and without limit, discriminating between the rich, who are usually hostile, and the poor or industrious, usually neutral or friendly. Foraging parties may also take mules or horses to replace the jaded animals of their trains, or to serve as pack mules for the regiments or brigades. In all foraging of whatever kind, the parties engaged will refrain from abusive or threatening language, and may, where the officer in command thinks proper, give written certificates of the facts, but no receipts, and they will endeavour to leave with each family a reasonable portion for their maintenance. Negroes who are able-bodied and can be of service to the several columns may be taken along, but each army commander will bear in mind that the question of supplies is a very important one, and that his first duty is to see to them who bear arms. Now, first point you should note in that one is that the last point is really a codicil from Sherman going, recruit them. Mainly, I think that's probably aimed at Blair, because quite a lot of the others worked that one out quite quickly. But also, the purpose of this is it's got to be speed of movement. That's the point of the March to the Sea, and this is shown greatly by this map, which is the movement tracks. These are 4 columns. They are moving as close together as they can. At certain points, you can see they divide into 5, and in reality, when you've got the cavalry moving around separately, you've got 6 columns, and sometimes even more. Down here is, off to the side, is Fort McAllister, and that's where the Navy manages to meet up and really give them their supplies. But the whole point about this is it's a march to the sea, is that it will enable them to divide the Confederacy up. And the other point you have to remember is there aren't really any battles fought in this campaign. There's a battle at Savannah, and there's been a battle for Atlanta to take that previously. The March to the Sea goes off, and Look at that map. There's no battle. There's no red lines. There's no opposition troops. Go to this map. Again. There's few, if any, opposition troops around there. They're mostly getting out of the way. This is a huge army coming down on. They don't want to be there. And when he gets to Savannah, this is what Sherman has to say. I've already received guns that can cast heavy and destructive shot as far as the heart of your city. Also, I have for some days held and controlled every avenue by which the people and garrison of Savannah may be supplied. And I am, therefore, justified in demanding the surrender of the city of Savannah and its dependent forts, and shall wait a reasonable time for your answer before opening with heavy ordnance. Should you entertain the proposition, I am prepared to grant liberal terms to the inhabitants and garrison, but should I be forced to resort to assault, or the sure process of starvation, I shall then feel justified in resorting to the harshest measures, and shall make little effort to restrain my army, burning to avenge the national wrong which they attach to Savannah and other large cities which have been so prominent in dragging our country into civil war. That, of course, was the message to William J. Hardy. Surprisingly, after that, well, Savannah garrison decides to go away, and, well, with a nice surrender, many thanks for your Christmas gift, the capture of Savannah. When you were about leaving Atlanta for the Atlantic coast, I was anxious, if not fearful. But feeling that you were the better judge, and remembering that nothing risked, nothing gained, I did not interfere. Now the undertaking has been assessed, the honour is yours, for I believe none of us went further than to acquiesce, and taking the work of General Thompson into account, as it should be taken, it is indeed a great success. Not only does it afford the obvious and immediate military advantages, but in showing to the world that your army could be divided, putting the stronger parts to an important new service, and yet leaving enough to vanquish. Not only does it afford the obvious and immediate military advantages, but in showing to the world that your army could be divided, putting the stronger part to an important new service, and yet leaving enough to vanquish the old opposing force of the whole, Hood's army, it brings those who stand in darkness to see a great light. But what next? I suppose it will be safer if I leave General Grant and yourself to decide. Please make my grateful acknowledgments to your whole army, officers and men. It's maneuver. It's winning a war without fighting a battle. But it is kind of curious, I always think, that Sherman doesn't have to fight a battle. Major Thomas, we got to him now. During the whole war, his services were transcendent, winning the first substantial victory at Mill Springs in Kentucky, January 20th, 1862, participating in all the campaigns of the West in 1862, 3 and 4, and finally December 16th, 1864, annihilating the army of Hood, which in midwinter had advanced to Nashville to besiege him. We're, of course, into the Franklin-Nashville campaign, also known as Hood's Tennessee campaign, if you really want to put it under the command of the idiot. And yes, I know I'm being slightly cruel about Hood, but there is a reason for this. It takes a massive degree of arrogance, a humongous degree of arrogance, to advance as he did. And how do I describe? I should describe Hood. Well, let's put it this way. So, Sherman leaves from Atlanta and Georgia. Hood, believing the fallacy that is, as long as the Confederacy army still exists, the Confederacy will still survive. So therefore, if he where he goes, the Sherman will follow him. Withdraws. He's literally going the other way. By October, he's in Gadsden. By the November, he's in Tuscumbia. by the 31st of October. Sherman doesn't leave Atlanta till the 15th of November, by which point Hood has been travelling away from him for most of a month, because he starts off in Palmetto on the 29th of September. Now, Sherman had done a little bit of wandering around after him, but very, very limited wandering around after him. In fact, it was, you could say for Sherman, it was the most half-hearted wandering you could possibly imagine. And then Hood gets an idea. I have an army of 39,000 troops. By the time he actually gets there, 30,000 troops. Now, I can't go and attack Sherman because sitting in my rear at Nashville is Thomas with roughly 55,000 troops. Admittedly, this force has slowly been sort of going up from Schofield, has withdrawn from Pulsaki, and slowly moved north. 22nd of November, 30th of November, moved up to reinforce to Thomas's position in Nashville. And Granger withdrew from Athens, Decanter, and Huntsville towards Stevenson, and actually Bridgeport earlier. So there had been forces withdrawing from him, but that should have been Hood's clue. They're withdrawing from me. They're not fighting me. Do I not matter? Why are they not holding these areas? Do they not matter? And honestly, some of them do, but the ones which matter are probably Chattanooga, Knoxville, to an extent Murfreesboro, which Forrest will go and have a attack on. But Nashville is probably the critical point. It's another critical point on the river, as is Johnsonville. And Forrest doesn't take those. You're talking about a war which is based on rivers, and a war which is based on railroads, and a war which is based on maneuver. And Hood, instead of maneuvering, decides that, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go and attack them in their strongest place where they're stronger than me. And I haven't got the heavy guns. I haven't got the artillery. And this is what happens to Hood. It's what happens to him. He eventually retreats all the way back to here, having lost nearly 20,000 troops in total during his campaign. Because he starts off with roughly 39,000 in Tuscumba in the 31st of October. By the time he gets back to Tupelo, he's got roughly 20,000. And when we say roughly 20,000, he's got 20,000 on paper. And yes, some are off in garrisons and various other things, but come on. So, this is the reason why Sherman doesn't have to fight a battle, marching all the way to Savannah, a critical city. Because the guy with the army for the Confederacy in this area, which had previously been Johnston, who has been removed in favor of Hood because Davis doesn't consider him aggressive enough because he'd been withdrawing to protect positions and maintaining his army for when he needed it, and happy to sacrifice areas which don't really support, can't really provide anything for the Confederacy. It's been replaced by the far more aggressive Hood, who's so aggressive, he goes and attacks someone who outnumbers him by, what, 5-3? If we're being generous. Possibly as many as 2-1 on the day. In terms of actual combatants. Oh, and this is a person who doesn't even... Thomas doesn't even really have to maneuver. He just has to wait there. It's sort of a case of, you're coming to me? You mean I don't have to do anything? You're coming to me? Thank you. So this is the army which it potentially, if it had attacked Atlanta, could have caused trouble for Sherman. It could have forced him to have to withdraw and protect Atlanta, or it could have, of course, forced Hood to Thomas. Hood could have forced Thomas to come out to engage him and actually have to get him into a maneuver battle to come and rescue Atlanta. But he doesn't. He goes for Nashville. Sherman's army is marching off, well, that way to the sea. And that's the army maneuver which is heading to Savannah. That's the big aggressive one coming to attack you. And your idea to get it to withdraw is to try and attack north. Again, there is a strategic problem at the heart of Confederacy in that they don't seem to... It's like what happens to the Japanese high command during World War II. Yes, on paper, the numbers are probably written there and they have an idea that how much they are outnumbered by the enemy. But it never seems to actually comprehend up here. And they've got a dashing Forrest running around being dashing and pointless. Yay, look at all the action. It's when activity starts to replace actual achievement as your barometer for if you're doing anything. There's a lot of activity going on, so we must be achieving something. We're not. Oh. Nashville happens. And again, you can tell the Hood's lack of heavy equipment. How? Because he's able to move freely away from rivers and away from railways. If you don't have to depend upon railway lines, and if you don't have to depend on rivers, that means you haven't got heavy equipment in the American Civil War. We go back here and we look at the map for this. Well, even though they're waiting for the fleet to bring in the really heavy equipment, you can see there are some key railway lines running along, which are getting there, and some key rivers running along, and they know where they're going to get the heavy equipment because there's a fleet coming. This is another maneuver campaign. Hood is trying to do a maneuver campaign on Thomas, and all he's got actually goes Thomas sitting there going, "Oh, you're coming, finally." Oh, good Lord. I thought I was actually going to have to come out and get you. This is the big battle, in many respects, of the March to the Sea. Because the Confederate Army is nowhere near where it should be. Anyway, thank you for watching this. I hope you don't mind that this long patrol has been quite as long as it is. And take care. Oh, and if you do get to the end, please comment with a timestamp.